In 1584, the people of Antwerp made a drastic decision. They flooded the land surrounding their city. They resorted to this drastic measure because the Spanish general Alessandro Farnese was marching toward them with one goal. He was determined to conquer Antwerp. At the time, the city was not only a major economic hub, but also the capital of the Dutch Revolt, the war for independence fought by the Dutch Republic against Spanish rule. For Farnese, stripping the insurgents of this vital stronghold would be the crowning achievement of a 7-year campaign against the rebellious provinces. The siege of Antwerp was worthy of an epic film. To starve the city into submission, the Spanish built a massive bridge across the 900-meter wide Scheldt River, cutting Antwerp off from the outside world. In a desperate attempt to free themselves from this iron grip, the defenders flooded the entire region, deployed fireships intending to destroy the bridge, and even built a colossal warship to break through and reconnect with their allies. The siege was one of the defining events of the century, and was closely followed by contemporary observers. Later, even the famous German poet Friedrich Schiller wrote an account of the events. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Antwerp. In 1577, Spain received the largest shipment of silver that had yet arrived from the New World. An enormous windfall that filled King Philip II's treasury and enabled him to renew his fight against the Dutch rebels. He entrusted the mission to his most capable commander, Alessandro Farnese, the future Duke of Parma, among historians just called Parma. Parma wasted no time. In 1579, he captured the strategic border city of Maastricht and began securing control over the southern Netherlands. The rebels soon found themselves under mounting pressure, which increased dramatically when a second front opened in the north. In March of 1580, George de Lalaing, Count of Rennenberg, who had been torn between loyalty to the Spanish crown and sympathy for the rebels, finally chose sides, aligning himself with Spain. As governor of Friesland, Groningen, Overijssel, Drenthe, and Lincoln, his defection carried weight. Most of these territories followed him. Only Friesland and the Ommelanden of Groningen remained loyal to the rebellion. The cities of Groningen, Delfzijl, and Oldenzaal sided with the governor. At the same time, King Philip II increased political pressure. He declared William of Orange, the leader and figurehead of the revolt, an outlaw. However, this external pressure had an unintended consequence. It unified the rebels. On the 26th of July 1581, the States General of the United Netherlands signed the Blockade van Verlatinge, in English, the Act of Abjuration, formally deposing Philip II as their sovereign. Today, this document is considered the declaration of independence of the Dutch Republic. While the Dutch began to search for a powerful patron to support their fight against Philip II, the Spanish offensive pressed on. In October of 1583, Lalaing's successor, Francisco Verdugo, captured Zutphen, situated on the IJssel River, the eastern border of the Republic. Zutphen became a strategic Spanish bridgehead. From there, Parma's troops launched thousands of attacks over the following years. To stop them, William of Orange tried to isolate Zutphen by establishing a defensive ring of forts with sizable garrisons in Lochem and Dort. For nearly 7 years, this prolonged war of position near the heartland became the rebels' primary focus. Parma exploited their distraction to launch attacks deeper into Flanders and Brabant, the industrial heart of the Netherlands. Parma was a brilliant strategist with a clear plan: to bring the region to its knees by severing its export routes, and with them its economic lifeblood. In 1583, he seized the coast of Flanders, then moved northeast to capture key cities along the Scheldt estuary, and then he tightened his grip by sealing off Brussels, Mechelen, and Ghent, before turning his full attention to Antwerp. At the time, Antwerp was the largest city in the region, home to over 100,000 people. It was the vibrant economic, financial, and cultural heart of northwestern Europe, and the capital of the Dutch Revolt. Considered the greatest prize of the southern Netherlands, its fall would be a devastating blow to the Republic. In early summer of 1584, a spy warned William of Orange that Parma was planning an attack on Antwerp. William acted immediately. He met with the city's mayor, Philips van Marnix van Sint Aldegonde, urging him to immediately prepare for a siege. William advised breaching the Kouwensteinse and Blauwaren dikes to flood a large area north of the city, allowing the Republic's fleet to support Antwerp by water and keep the Spanish from establishing a foothold nearby. In the meantime, William promised to assemble a relief army as quickly as possible should the city come under siege. After the meeting, Aldegonde informed the city council, stressing that Antwerp's fate and possibly the Republic's independence hung in the balance. He urged immediate action to carry out William's plan, but many council members doubted Parma could truly threaten the city, convinced he couldn't completely cut Antwerp off from its allies. In addition, the Butchers' Guild strongly opposed the plan, fearing the floods would destroy their most productive pasture land, where they fattened around 12,000 oxen each year. Despite Aldegonde's urgent warnings, the skeptics won out. The council's only response was to reinforce the existing defenses along the Scheldt, build a few additional redoubts, and breach the dikes at Saftingen to flood that area. The preparations were barely complete when a cavalry vanguard suddenly swept through the area, pillaging as foot soldiers moved to seize strategic positions. The Spanish had arrived. Parma was reaching for the greatest prize of the southern Netherlands. The main Spanish force reached Antwerp on the 3rd of July, 1584. Lacking sufficient troops to launch a direct assault, Parma planned to blockade the city and starve it into submission. To accomplish this, he divided his army into two groups. The first, led by Peter Ernst I von Mansfeld Vorderort, and Cristobal de Mondragon, crossed the Scheldt at Kruibeke to go around the city, while the second targeted Fort Liefkenshoek. The Spanish first attempted to storm the fort, but were repelled by the defenders. Realizing a second assault would likely fail, and that securing a position quickly was crucial, they resorted to a clever ruse. They loaded several wagons with hay and damp grass, set them ablaze, and pushed them toward the fort's walls. The thick smoke obscured the defenders' vision, allowing the attackers to silently scale the walls. Suddenly, the Spanish surged over the ramparts, overwhelming the defenders and capturing the fort. Parma had successfully completed his first crucial step. He had gained a foothold just outside the city. As if the loss of Fort Liefkenshoek weren't enough, the Republic suffered an even more devastating blow on the very same day. On the 10th of July, 1584, the Catholic Balthasar Gerard forced his way into William of Orange's residence in Delft and shot him 3 times at close range. The father of the Republic died almost instantly. The assassination was a calculated political strike, long planned and coordinated with Parma. With William's death, the rebellion lost its unifying figure. His son and successor, Maurice of Orange, would one day become a brilliant general, but at just 17, he was too young to assume high command over the forces of the provinces. According to historian Olaf van Nimwegen, an expert on the Dutch Revolt, quote, "This left the rebel troops without a commander-in-chief." Still, the battle for Antwerp pressed on, and by mid-July, the Spanish had established a camp near Starbruck. Soon after, Mondragon launched an assault on Fort Lillo. As his men prepared to storm the position, the defenders accidentally triggered one of their own mines, killing dozens of their own troops. But despite the chaos, Mondragon failed to take the fort. Undeterred by this setback, the Spanish continued their advance, capturing additional fortifications along the Scheldt and reinforcing the dikes to prevent the defenders from flooding additional flatlands. Step by step, Parma sealed Antwerp off. Only when the noose was tightening around their necks did Antwerp's defenders grasp the true gravity of their situation. The swift Spanish advance made it clear that the Duke of Parma might accomplish what they believed impossible. At last, even the Butchers' Guild relented and agreed to breach the dikes. But it was too late. The Spanish had already taken control of the Kouwensteinse dike, a critical position that blocked access to the city, even if the additional fields were flooded. The looming blockade and the suffering it promised drove many to flee Antwerp. Those who stayed were left wondering how they would provide for themselves. The Spanish had installed batteries on both banks of the Scheldt, firing on any ship that attempted to pass. A few transports still managed to slip through to the city's harbor, but that lifeline could be severed at any moment. In response, the city council ordered every resident to stockpile enough provisions to last 2 years. Predictably, the plan failed. The wealthy bought little, fearing their stores would be looted. The poor bought little because they couldn't afford more. Many had always lived hand to mouth, hardly able to buy food for 2 days, let alone 2 years. Now they found themselves completely exposed. The council tried to fix the situation by imposing a grain price cap, but this also backfired. Low prices, combined with the threat of the Spanish cannon fire, discouraged most captains from risking the journey, leaving Antwerp's granaries woefully understocked. By autumn, the situation had become dire. Starvation loomed. The city might not have survived the winter had a fleet from the Allied provinces not broken through with a desperately needed shipment of grain just before the winter cold set in. In October, Parma established his headquarters in Beveren. Strategically, this was an excellent choice. From there, he could simultaneously threaten Antwerp, Brussels, Ghent, Dendermonde, and Mechelen. By now, the blockade of Antwerp was nearly complete. The city could only be reached by water, and Parma set out to cut off that final corridor of entry. His plan seemed insane. The Spanish general intended to build a bridge across the Scheldt River at a point more than 900 meters wide. Again, the people of Antwerp dismissed his idea as impossible. They watched in disbelief as hundreds of carpenters and engineers began constructing forts on both banks and driving heavy pilings into the river to anchor the bridgeheads. The river's current made it impossible to span the full width with fixed structures. To close the gap between the bridgeheads, Parma ordered the confiscation of 220 platen, flat-bottomed ships commonly used on the inland waterways of the region. These would form a pontoon bridge across the remaining stretch of water. Work on the massive structure occupied the Spanish into the early winter. Then, as the river froze over, construction ground to a halt, quite literally put on ice. Around the same time, Parma received intelligence from a spy inside Antwerp. Tensions were running high, and the city council had even imprisoned several prominent citizens for attempting to negotiate with the Spanish without authorization, hoping to exploit the internal unrest, or even better, compel the city to surrender. Parma sent a letter to the council on the 13th of November, offering extraordinarily generous terms. He promised leniency and protection if the defenders agreed to capitulate. The people of Antwerp weren't interested, replying with dry wit that they too were willing to spare him if he chose to retreat. They had no intention of surrendering the city without a fight. As the ice began to melt, the Spanish resumed construction on the bridge. By late February, a chain of 32 ships stretched nearly 730 meters between the two fortified bridgeheads. But this was no ordinary pontoon bridge. The vessels were lashed together with chains and planks to form the foundation of a floating wall, complete with a sturdy parapet and artillery emplacements. To protect it, 2 outer rows of boats, armed with sharpened stakes, created a floating barricade, while a flotilla of 40 warships stood ready along the banks of the Scheldt. More than 1,500 soldiers manned the structure. The German writer Friedrich Schiller, who later penned a detailed account of the siege, described the bridge in almost mythical terms. Quote, "This terrible machine was so artfully constructed and so richly armed with instruments of death that it could defend itself like a living creature, spewing fire at a word of command and pouring destruction on all who came near it." When the defenders realized the Spanish had actually completed the bridge, disbelief gave way to dread. Antwerp was now cut off entirely. It was only a matter of time before starvation took hold. The people of Antwerp had to break free from the Spanish grip, and the sooner the better. To reopen access to the city, at least for smaller and shallow draft ships, they flooded additional land on both sides of the Scheldt. This reduced the dependence on the river as a sole waterway and forced the Spanish to abandon some of their positions. Several Spanish forts were also flooded, or at least cut off from the rest of their network. At the same time, the city's garrison launched frequent raids against the Spanish lines. These sorties occasionally inflicted losses on the besiegers, but caused little lasting damage. Most Spanish positions were heavily fortified and bristling with artillery, which the Dutch could not effectively counter from their boats. It was becoming clear that the only way to loosen the Spanish stranglehold was to break the blockade on the Scheldt. In mid-March, the defenders received grim news. Brussels, the region's second-largest city, had surrendered. Seizing the moment, Alessandro intensified his pressure on the political stage. He urged the States General to speed up their search for an ally, and once again called on the nearby provinces of Zeeland and Holland to send ships to harass the Spanish and divert their attention from Antwerp. Meanwhile, the Republic's fleet had been far from idle. Since the siege began, it had been working to restrict Spanish movements and keep Antwerp resupplied, most notably the crucial grain delivery just before winter. In early April of 1585, Justinus von Nassau sailed up the Scheldt with a larger fleet. Within weeks, they recaptured Fort Liefkenshoek and several other fortresses on Dul Island, securing a strategic foothold near the Spanish bridge. Positioned here, they awaited a signal from Antwerp's defenders to launch their attack. The plan was to blow up the bridge, split the Spanish forces, and attack from both sides at once. Federico Giambelli, a military engineer from Mantua, who had a score to settle with the Spanish, was chosen to take on the bridge. A resourceful craftsman, Giambelli had previously offered his services to Philip II, but the Spanish king, as historian Christopher Duffy puts it, quote, had little time for such gadgetry, and he used his courtiers and servants to keep Federico Giambelli at an arm's length. End quote. Frustrated, the Italians settled in Antwerp, married a local woman, and earned a living as a physicist and mechanic. When he learned the Spanish were building their massive bridge, however, the old fire within him reignited. Giambelli requested 2 large boats from the city council, loaded each with around 7,000 pounds of gunpowder, and packed them with scrap rubble and scrap iron. Soon, he had his 2 floating infernal machines, as contemporaries called them, ready. On a starry night, Giambelli lit the fuses, set the boats adrift, and let the current carry them toward Parma's bridge. One ran aground before reaching its target, but the other struck the base of a bridgehead. A moment of tense silence was shattered by a deafening explosion. A 60-meter wide gap tore through the structure, and the deadly cargo of Giambelli's fireships rained for miles around. According to Christopher Duffy, the blast killed around 800 Spanish. Parma himself escaped by the skin of his teeth. Aldegonde had sent scouts by boat to survey the scene and assess the damage. But as the men cautiously approached the wreckage, cast in a flickering light by the burning remains of the fireships, fear gripped them. Another explosion might still be imminent. Without ever getting a clear view of the bridge, they turned back and reported to Aldegonde that the structure remained intact. Disappointed, he called off the operation. By the time the mayor learned the true extent of the destruction, it was too late. Parma had already re-established his barricades across the Scheldt. In the weeks that followed, the people of Antwerp made several more attempts to blow up the bridge, always with the same disappointing results. They soon realized that breaking the Spanish blockade this way was impossible, and shifted their focus to the Couwensteinse dike instead. This nearly 4-kilometer long dam between Starbruck and the Scheldt was the only barrier preventing Allied ships from sailing parallel to the river through the flooded area to reach Antwerp. The problem was that Parma had also recognized its strategic importance and had heavily fortified the narrow strip of land. Still, if the defenders could manage to breach the dike, Parma's bridge would be rendered useless, and the path to the city would be wide open. On the 7th of May, the Dutch were ready. Following the plan used in the recent attack on the bridge, the garrison would make a sortie with 3 ships and 60 Platen, to push forward toward the dike while the relief fleet attacked from the opposite side. This time, the expected signal rocket soared over the city, and Justinus von Nassau advanced. He landed on the dike with 500 Zeelanders and immediately faced stiff resistance. After a fierce and bloody melee, his men managed to repel the Spanish and began digging in. For a while, they bravely held their ground against Parma's superior forces, but the planned attack from the other side never came. When the crossfire from 2 Spanish entrenchments flanking their position grew more intense, they were forced to retreat. The reason for the garrison's troops' failure to appear remains unclear, but it was likely a simple misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that cost the lives of dozens of valiant soldiers. Meanwhile, the people of Antwerp had completed another ambitious project under Jambelli's supervision. Over the winter and spring, they had built the largest warship ever launched in Antwerp, a massive floating artillery platform. The defenders pinned all their hopes on this colossal vessel, christening it Finis Belli, meaning the end of war. Resembling a floating castle, the Finis Belli was armed with 44 cannons, manned with 500 musketeers, and fortified with massive breastworks and armored crow's nests, allowing the crew to fire down on the Spanish positions. In mid-May, Antwerp's forces attempted to position this giant warship near Parma's bridge to keep it under constant fire. Unfortunately, the floating platform proved too heavy to maneuver effectively in the shallow waters of the flooded area. How exactly the Finis Belli met its end remains unclear. Some sources say it ran aground when the tide changed. Others claim it hit a dike shortly after leaving the harbor. Either way, Jambelli's second invention also failed to save Antwerp. On the night of the 26th of May, the Dutch launched a second amphibious assault on the Couwensteinse dike. At dusk, all available ships left the harbor, while Justinus of Nassau set out with the Count of Hohenlohe and the relief fleet from the opposite side. This time, they threw everything into the battle, and the coordination finally worked. The Antwerp forces, led by Aldegonde himself, began the attack with a ruse. they sent 4 fireships toward the dike, making the Spanish believe they were facing floating bombs once again. Haunted by the memory of the attack on Parma's bridge, the Spanish soldiers immediately took cover. Too late, they realized it was a trick. In the brief moments when they ducked behind their parapets, dozens of ships emerged from the darkness. Seconds later, the Dutch troops jumped ashore, erected 2 redoubts from gabions they had brought with them, and immediately began demolishing the dike between them. The Spanish reacted swiftly. They desperately tried to destroy the makeshift fortifications and keep the waiting rebel ships at a distance with their cannons, but they were overwhelmed by the unexpected Dutch superiority. The Dutch forces pushed them back step by step until suddenly a loud cheer erupted. The dike had been breached, and the first cargo ship, laden with supplies, set course for Antwerp. Hohenlohe and Aldegonde triumphantly boarded the passing freighter to proclaim their victory in the city. However, they soon learned their jubilation was premature. The Spanish counterattacked. Parma, awakened by cannon fire, quickly brought more artillery into position along the Scheldt and advanced against the Dutch. Simultaneously, Mansfeld pushed onto the dike from the land side. Shortly after, some 5,000 men crowded the narrow strip of land, engaging in a desperate, brutal battle. Soldiers hacked at each other with entrenching tools, musket butts and torches, while the muddy ground was strewn with the dead and dying. Gradually, the Spanish pushed the Dutch back and began to gain the upper hand. When the tide of the sea finally shifted, making navigation difficult, the defenders' resistance crumbled. The men of the relief fleet scrambled to save themselves aboard their ships, drifting away with the outgoing tide and leaving Antwerp to its fate. The defeat at the Kouwensteinse dike abruptly ended the garrison's resistance. From then on, with each passing day of the blockade, food grew scarcer, and calls for surrender grew louder. Until on the 17th of August 1585, Aldegonde finally struck the flags. Parma's terms were generous, but all Protestants were forced to leave Antwerp within 4 years. This led to a massive depopulation, with barely 40,000 inhabitants remaining. Antwerp's golden era had come to a violent and tragic close. The conquest of Antwerp was the crowning achievement for Parma's offensive. The strategic heartland of the Republic was now encircled. Verdugo had entrenched himself along the IJssel to the east, while Parma stood at the gates of Sealand in the south. However, Philip II failed to capitalize on this hard-won advantage and seized the opportunity to crush the rebellion once and for all. Instead, the Spanish king dreamed of invading England and ordered Parma to prepare the southern Netherlands as a launching point for an attack across the English Channel. When the famed Spanish Armada's invasion attempt failed in 1588, Philip shifted his focus to France, dispatching Parma to prepare the ground there. Parma spent 3 years with these futile campaigns, before dying weary and frustrated in Arras on the night of the 2nd of December 1592. By deploying his troops in campaigns against England and France, Philip II not only missed the chance to reclaim control of the Netherlands, but also gave the rebels time to regroup. During these years, Maurice of Orange grew into a skilled strategist and charismatic leader, soon ready to lead the reformed armies of the Republic on to a counteroffensive. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more videos on niche topics like the 80 Years' War, please consider donating on Patreon. We appreciate every little bit of support, a like, a comment, or a donation. So, thank you.